Hello, everyone, and welcome to this webinar on the topic of flooding. Today's webinar covers the recently published World Bank Global Gas Flooding Tracker Report for 2021 and is presented by Zubin Banji, Debbie Walker, and Adam Pollard of the World Bank GTFR Partnership. IPCA is a supported organization of the World Bank Zero Routine Flooding by 2030 initiative, and it's a pleasure to have the GTFR present this webinar today. My name is Lorena Perez. I'm the Senior Manager for Climate here at IPCA. And before we start, I would like to cover a few housekeeping items. The webinar is being streamed through your computer, so there is no dial-in number. Everything you can see, including the slides, is resizable and movable, so feel free to move things around and get the most out of your screen. At the bottom of your screen, you will see some features that are available. You can use the Q&A box to ask questions as we go. And also there is a help feature, but most issues can be sorted by refreshing the page using the F5 key. This is particularly useful if you think your slides are falling behind. A recording will be available later this week and can be accessed using the same link you are using now. And now I would like to say a few words about IPCA for those of you who are not familiar with the organization. IPCA was formed in 1974 following the launch of the UNEP, the United Nations Environment Programme, and we are the only global association upstream and downstream oil and gas industry. We are not an advocacy organization and concentrate on technical and fact-based information to advance the environmental and social performance of the oil and gas industry sector and also its contribution to the energy transition in the context of sustainable development. 33 of our company members now have net zero commitments by 2050, which is more than half of our membership. This covers Scope 1 and 2 operational emissions, but 9 of our members also include Scope 3 emissions in their net zero by 2050 aims. But we also need to consider opportunities in the near term. The Glasgow Pact recognizes that limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees requires rapid, deep, and sustained reductions in global greenhouse gas emissions. To reduce the footprint of oil and gas operations and minimize Scope 1 and 2 emissions, especially in the near term to 2030, then 2 opportunities really stand out. One is methane reduction, and the other is flooding reduction, which is why we jointly with IOGP and the World Bank GTFR, IPCA has produced a new guidance document on flooding management for the oil and gas industry, and which is why IPCA is a supporting organization to the GTFR Zero Routine Flooding Initiative. I would also like to draw your attention to the oil and gas sector roadmap on the Sustainable Development Goals that is available on our website. I'm pleased that this webinar on flooding and its reduction will bring to life several of the SDGs. So not just SDG 7 on access to the energy, but SDG 3 on good health and well-being, SDG 9 on infrastructure, and SDG 17 on partnership and collaboration. As mentioned earlier, we are joined by Zubin Banji, Debbie Walker, and Adam Pollard of the World Bank GTFR Partnership. You can find Zubin, Debbie, and Adam bios in this webinar page, and I will let the speakers introduce themselves, but I would like to take this opportunity to welcome back the World Bank GTFR, who joined us for a webinar on flooding actually back in June last year. I'm really looking forward to hear what has happened in the interim. So with that, I will pass over to you, Zubin, and then Debbie, and finally, Adam. So Zubin, please, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you so much, Lorena, and thanks to IPCA for this opportunity. This is, I think, our 3rd year in a row where we will present to IPCA members, and we greatly appreciate the chance to have an exchange with IPCA members and for all of us to sort of understand what the status is of global flaring, and then a little bit about what we do with our work program. My name is Zubin Banji. As Lorena said, I am the program manager of the World Bank's GTFR Trust Fund. Today, what we want to provide you with is an overview of the 2021 global flaring satellite data, give you a sense of the progress made towards the global initiative to end routine flaring in the next 7 years. And to aid in that, I'm joined by my colleagues from the GGFR team. We have Debbie Walker, who is an advisor on our technical team, and Adam Pollard, who is GGFR's External Affairs Officer. Adam also manages the Zero Routine Flaring Initiative for the World Bank and GGFR. Now, as you all are well aware, for the oil and gas industry, 2021 was, for all intents and purposes, a continuation of the unprecedented, disruptive, and volatile year that was 2020. The COVID-19 pandemic continued to create instability in oil demand and prices, and countries worldwide faced not only sustained budgetary pressure, but also repeated setbacks in the reopening of their economies and getting things right back to normal. And as we begun to slowly emerge from the pandemic this year, the Russian invasion of Ukraine has further destabilized the global economy and, of course, the energy sector tremendously. How this will impact flaring volumes this year is hard to gauge at this point, but part of our work program is to monitor the situation closely, which we do on a regular basis throughout the year. So what's the overall picture? Well, in 2021, last year, about 144 billion cubic meters of gas was flared globally. Disappointingly, this is a 1% increase on the 142 billion cubic meters flared in 2020. More concerningly, progress on reducing global gas flaring volumes has plateaued not just in 2020 and 2021, but for much of the past decade, as Debbie will show you all in just a moment. So this is something that has concerned us quite a bit and is one of the reasons that we appreciate the opportunity to speak with IPECA members about the situation. So this global plateau, as we put it, masks impressive reductions in some countries where there has been progress been made. And unfortunately, these reductions and the progress made has been offset by concerning increases in other countries. So, for example, promising progress has been made in the United States, in Kazakhstan, in Colombia, and Nigeria. And in many of these cases, our review of global gas flaring and venting regulations indicates that effective regulation has played a role in facilitating these reductions. Of course, understanding the drivers of change in flaring requires and benefits from on-the-ground experience. And we welcome the input and perspectives of those operating in these markets. So please do reach out to us if you have questions or information about the situation in specific countries or in specific regions as well. Now, the progress made by these countries that I mentioned, many of whom are developing economies, gives us hope that progress on ending routine gas flaring will accelerate over the next few years, particularly in those countries that have the regulations, the political will in space, the policies in place as well. That is all key to ending routine flaring and addressing venting as well. The data also highlights, as Debbie will show, the scale and persistence of gas flaring. In 2021, last year, the top 10 flaring countries accounted for 3/4 or 75% of all gas flared and 50% of global oil production. Half of these top 10 countries have committed to the World Bank's Zero Routine Flaring Initiative, and the top 7 have remained in this position for the last decade. So there's no doubt that many of these countries face significant barriers and challenges to addressing flaring, and that's why we exist at the World Bank. This is something that we want to facilitate. This is something that we want to support countries with, and this is why we exist, as I mentioned. And you might have heard just last week, the United States government and Germany are also going to join the World Bank's GDFR partnership starting in 2023. Another indication of how important this issue is for the oil and gas industry. So that was good news for us because it means governments in both the United States and Germany know that industry has to accelerate its efforts in the next year, the next 2-3 years to reduce flaring and methane emissions. Then if you hadn't heard about it, the announcement was made during a virtual Major Economies Forum on Energy and Climate hosted by the US President Joe Biden and also the US Special Presidential Envoy for Climate, John Kerry. This just happened last Friday, actually. And in the forum, they provide an opportunity for world leaders to discuss the progress achieved at COP26, which was held in Glasgow last year. They also discuss the priorities and challenges going forward and ways that countries can work together to accelerate their climate efforts. So with that brief introduction, I'll hand over to Debbie for her to walk us through the data analysis for last year. We'll begin with key flaring indicators, as we have in showing you on this slide that's up on the screen right now. And then we'll also talk about a handful of country case studies, and then we'll shed some light on the important contribution flaring and flare elimination make to addressing methane emissions. And then we move to our new metric, the imported flare gas index, and what it shows for 2021. And then Adam finishes off the presentation with an update on the Zero Routine Flaring Initiative. I also wanted to just take a moment to share a couple of our more recent knowledge products and things that could support your organizations. On the far left, we have the Global Flaring Tracker Report that Debbie's going to talk a little bit about and that we are presenting today. The one right next to it is our Global Regulatory Review, which we just released a few months ago. This provides a systematic analysis of regulatory frameworks and policies governing the flaring and venting of gas in 21 oil-producing countries. And then there's also some sub-jurisdictions in a few of those countries, like the United States. This report was designed to raise awareness and to help trigger some of the action by identifying the most successful approaches to flaring and venting reduction. There's also a microsite on flaring regulation around the world, and I encourage you all to visit that website because it's quite interesting. It allows you to compare and contrast different regulations in a number of countries. Then the report right below the Global Regulatory Review is our financing solutions to reduce flaring and methane emissions, which provides a systematic framework for evaluating the feasibility of financing flare reduction projects. And there's a specific focus in this report on medium-sized flaring sites that have historically been difficult to tackle. So that is sort of the emphasis of this report. And then on the bottom left of this slide, you see our recent report on small-scale technologies for utilizing associated gas. The other two items on this slide, Debbie and Adam will talk a little bit about. So let me just stop there and introduce Debbie to take you through the next few slides, and then we'll be happy to answer some questions at the end of the presentation. Thanks again for joining us, and Debbie, off to you.
Thank you, Zubin. Okay, so I'm going to take you through some of the key flaring indicators that we use to track global gas flaring and some of the key themes from this year's Gas Flaring Tracker Report, which was published at the beginning of May. So the first of our indicators is, of course, gas flare volume, and that's shown in red in the chart here. And the units are billion cubic meters of gas flared. And this data set that we have of gas flaring comes from satellite observations of flaring. And we have data now going back as far as 1996. Now, the technology of the instrumentation on these satellites that measures flaring has evolved over that time. But this gives us a good data set with which to track trends in gas flaring. The other thing we're showing on this chart here is global oil production, which is in million barrels of oil per day, and that's in black. Now, usually these two things track each other, so it's useful to look at them together, right? The more oil you produce, the more gas associated with the oil and the more gas flaring. So what we look for in this data is any decoupling of these two elements. And what we can see in this chart is that there has been a decoupling of oil production and flaring back in the early 2000s. But unfortunately, over the last decade, reductions in flaring have really plateaued and flare volumes have largely stayed the same. And that's really one of the key themes of this year's report, this plateau at a time where we really would have hoped for more progress on flare reduction. And as Zubin mentioned, this global total actually masks that there have been some reductions in flaring in some countries, which have unfortunately been eroded by increases in flaring in other countries. And I have a slide that shows that a little later on. So sticking with 2021 just now, what this is showing is the individual flare volume at each individual flare site detected by the satellite for 2021. And the size and the color of the triangle indicate the magnitude of the flaring. And what this is really showing is that in some oil-producing countries like Iraq and Iran in the Middle East, and Algeria in North Africa, in Russia, Venezuela and Mexico, you have very large individual flares, so very significant volumes of gas going through one individual flare. Contrast oil-producing countries like the US, where you have lots of very small flares that are geographically dispersed over a large location or a large area. And that really highlights the different challenges that these countries face. So the technology that you would use to recover and eliminate very large individual flares is quite different from the technology that you need to explore for recovering lots of smaller volumes that are geographically dispersed. This pie chart then shows the relative contribution of each country to overall gas flare volumes in 2021. We can see that those countries with large individual flares like Russia, Iraq, Iran, Venezuela, Mexico make up a large portion of overall gas flaring, but so too do countries where there are lots and lots of smaller flares like the domestic US and Nigeria. And you can see from this pie chart that flaring is really dominated by 10 or so countries that sit on the right-hand side of this pie chart going round clockwise. So in this chart here, what we're showing are the top 30 flaring countries ranked by their 2021 flare volume, which is the very thin red bar on this chart, with the previous year's flare data shown as well to get an indication of the trend. And in previous reports, we've really focused on the top 7 flaring countries. But in this year's report, we've extended that to look at the top 10. That top 7, incidentally, hasn't changed year on year. That list of countries has remained the same. So that's Russia, Iraq, Iran, the United States, Venezuela, Algeria, and Nigeria. This year, we're bringing in Mexico, Libya, and China because we're seeing an increase in flaring in these countries. And because we like round numbers at GGFR, and this top 10 is 75% of all gas flaring and 50% of global oil production. Another key indicator that we look at in each report, in each reporting cycle, is flaring intensity. So that's the volume of gas flared per barrel of oil produced. So this chart shows the same countries in that same order ranking, ranked by 2021 flare volume, but this time we've divided by that country's oil production to get the flaring intensity. And what we can see is by looking at flare intensity, that changes that order ranking quite considerably. And we see that fragile, conflict-affected and insecure countries like Yemen, Syria, Venezuela have very high flaring intensities. But also showing this, looking at the trend over the last 10 years, we're able to see where there have been increases in flaring intensity, which indicates a worsening of performance. So either flaring is increasing at a time that production is declining, or flaring is increasing higher than production is increasing, indicating that things are getting worse in that country. We can see where there's some strong performance in flare intensity, the countries that are circled in green. And we can see where there may be opportunities for us as the GGFR to engage with countries and strive to help them improve their flaring intensity. Countries like Gabon, Kazakhstan, the Republic of Congo, Turkmenistan, and Algeria. GGFR already has active programs in place in Gabon, and we aspire to have programs in place in Algeria and Turkmenistan shortly. This chart then shows the percentage change in flaring intensity since those records began in 1996. And what this chart shows us is similar to the chart on flare volume. Despite some strong initial progress, improvements in flare intensity have plateaued over the last decade as well. And that unfortunately holds true for our GGFR partner countries as well. That's the blue line in this chart. And those partner countries that are included in that analysis are listed on the left-hand side. So plateau at a time of progress, holding true for gas flare volumes and for flaring intensity also. And I mentioned at the beginning, as did Zubin, that this plateau actually masks that there has been some improvement in some countries, which has unfortunately been eroded by increases in flaring in other countries. So what this chart is showing is the change in flare volume from 2012 to 2021, so over the last decade, with those countries with the largest increase shown in red, and those countries with the largest decrease shown in green. And in this year's report, we've taken a deeper dive into some of these countries, our case study countries, to try and understand what's going on with flaring in these countries and where, importantly, there might be lessons learned or opportunities to share best practice, and where, if things are not improving, we can try and understand what it is that's going wrong. So the countries marked in this, with an asterisk here are the countries that have been included in this year's report. I'll talk a little more about these case study countries now. So we selected 6 countries to look at in a little more detail in this year's report. 4 countries where we see promising reductions in flaring, and 2 countries where there have been increases indicating some worrying trends. The 4 countries that had promising reductions, so all the countries that we looked at, as case study countries are up here with some important parameters. We're showing that country's 2021 ranking, so where they sit on that bar chart, their 2021 flare volume position, if you like, the percentage change in flaring over the last decade, and the percentage change in flare intensity over the last decade. And the reason that we're looking at flaring and flare intensity together is that together they indicate where there's been a real performance improvement in flaring, and not just flare volumes reducing because production is declining. So for example, if you look at Kazakhstan and the US, both of these countries have seen a reduction in flare volume, but an even greater reduction in flare intensity. And in both these countries, that reduction in flaring is happening at a time where production has actually been increasing, which really indicates a performance improvement. Something is happening in these countries to reduce flare volumes and put that gas to good use, to effective utilization, instead of being wasted. Contrast Mexico, where we see an increase in flare volume and an even more significant increase in flare intensity. And that's actually because in Mexico, that increase in flaring is happening at a time that production is declining. Now that might seem counterintuitive. How can flaring increase as production declines? But I'll explain a little more about what's happening in Mexico in a few slides. So in the next 2 slides, I'll share an example of one good news story, the US in this case, and one bad news story, which is Mexico. So in the United States, what we see in the chart on the top right-hand side of this slide is this decoupling I mentioned in the first slide of oil production and flare volume. So you can see oil production in red, and then a very steep decrease in flare volume in blue. And that represents a 51% reduction in flaring in the Permian, Bakken, and Eagle Ford, so the shale-producing basins, which account for 89% of all flaring in the US in 2021. And that reduction has largely been achieved because there is a strong market for the gas both domestically within the US and in export in the form of liquefied natural gas, or LNG. And because that strong market exists, it has encouraged and incentivized investment in the infrastructure needed to take that gas from the production sites to that market. We know from our global regulatory review that was published in tandem with this Global Gas Flaring Tracker report that there are regulations in place in Texas and in Colorado to support these flare reductions, but there is evidence that stronger enforcement is needed if the US is going to sustain these reductions going forward. And that's really a key takeaway or a key finding of our global regulatory review, that it is one thing to have the regulations to support flare reduction, but that needs to be backed up with strong monitoring and enforcement of those regulations to make sure that the aspirations are realized. On to Mexico then, a country where there's been an increase in flaring at a decline in production. And you can see that in the chart on the top right-hand side, the blue flaring increasing as production in red is declining. Now, why this is happening is as oil fields age, the gas to oil ratio tends to increase. So you tend to produce more gas for the same barrels of oil. And that, coupled with the lack of investment in the gas infrastructure, is leading to very high flare volumes in Mexico at a time when production is declining. Oil production is declining. We also know that in the marine region, nitrogen is used for artificial lift, and that leads to a produced gas that has a very high nitrogen content, and that can't be processed at the onshore gas processing facilities. So as a result, this off-spec gas, if you like, is flared instead of being processed. And you can see from the chart on the top right-hand side that this uptick or this change, this increase in flaring has really happened since around 2018. And if you look at the area chart in the bottom right-hand corner of this chart, that flaring increase is occurring at a time where Mexico is increasing its reliance on gas imports. So we know that Mexico, like many other governments globally, is very concerned about energy security. And this really highlights the important role that recovering this flare gas could play in energy security for Mexico. And of course, that is not unique to Mexico. And really, we hope highlights to everyone on the call the importance of flare gas and recovering these wasted volumes to put to beneficial use. Given the focus on methane in the wake of COP26 and the Global Methane Pledge, and it's a really, really important topic for industry at the moment, we want to take a moment to stress the important role that flaring plays in methane emissions reduction. So many of you on the call, I'm sure, will know that flaring is a direct source of methane, but in case anyone is wondering how that could be, because flares are combustion devices, so aren't they burning all of the methane? Flares are control devices. They're designed to dispose of waste gas streams. And that's very different from something like a gas turbine or a gas engine, which is designed to really optimize that combustion activity and recover all of that energy from the gas, which is being used as fuel. A flare isn't designed with that same efficiency. And most estimates, including our own, assume a 98% destruction efficiency for flares. So 2% of the methane in the flare gas stream is released uncombusted. Now, that number could be higher or lower depending on a number of variables. The prevailing wind conditions at the flare tip and wind speed, the composition of the gas going to the flare, the velocity of that gas stream, and the operation and maintenance of the flare gas system itself and how effectively it's operating. And the IEA released a study last year which indicated their view that because of a lack of global operation and maintenance practices at oil production sites, that destruction efficiency could be a lot lower, and they suggested a figure of 92%. Now, some operators are actually taking steps to monitor their own flares and actually measure flare destruction efficiency. But in the absence of widespread data availability to inform any estimates of methane emissions from flaring, this figure of 98% tends to be the default value that's used. But it's clearly an opportunity and an area for research, and something GGFR is going to be looking into in more detail, because clearly if that number is higher, the methane emissions from flaring are reduced, but likewise if that number is lower, then the flaring emissions could be much more significant than our current estimates indicate. But regardless, by far the best thing we can do to eliminate methane emissions from flaring is to eliminate flaring. And that flare elimination and gas utilization is actually really important to abate the methane emissions from other sources as well. So if you imagine a gas production or an oil and gas production facility, there may be sources of methane in the form of venting or fugitive releases. And if there is no other outlet for the gas, when those emissions are recovered, they will end up going to the flare. So flare elimination and gas utilization is really important to enable the effective elimination of methane from other sources as well. Last indicator for me to talk about is the imported flare gas index. Now, this is a new metric that we launched last year in last year's report for the first time. And this slide here just shows the math of the index, but bear with me. The premise of this index is that if a country is importing crude oil, it is also importing the flaring intensity of those barrels. And what we hope is that by using this index to inform oil importing countries of this flaring exposure, we will encourage them to be more mindful about their crude oil imports and their oil and gas value chain, and potentially, hopefully, engage in a discussion with the producing countries and take action together to eliminate flaring and enable flare reduction. So this bar chart shows the 2021 imported flare gas index for the top 20 Annex 1 countries. And what this analysis shows, and is really one of the beautiful things about this indicator, is that countries that we would not typically think of as high flaring countries, so countries like Norway and France, for example, are exposed to high flaring because of the countries that they import crude from. So Norway there we can see is importing crude from Nigeria in yellow and Cameroon. And France, for example, is importing crude from Algeria and from Nigeria, both high flaring countries, right? Recall both of those are in our top 10 flaring countries. So this really indicates the exposure these countries have to high flaring. What we're showing in this chart here is high crude importing countries, so countries that import more than 250,000 barrels of oil per day. And along the x-axis, we're showing that volume of crude import in terms of 1,000 barrels of oil per day, and the imported flare gas index. And then there's a line here sitting at about 5.12, which is the average international flaring intensity globally. So anything sitting above that line, any country sitting above that line is exposed to high flaring because of the countries that they choose to import crude oil from. So in summary then, and before I hand over to my colleague, Adam, our Global Gas Flaring Tracker report this year really highlights that there is a plateau in global gas flare reduction at a time where we would really expect there to have been more progress. But these global figures mask a strong performance improvement in some countries that's been eroded by increases in others. Our case studies, in parallel with our global regulatory review, indicate the importance of an integrated gas value chain, a market for the gas, and the gas having value somewhere other than in the flare, and that those can be supported by strong regulation in the form of incentives and penalties, but that has to be coupled with effective monitoring and enforcement of those regulations. We note that flare elimination is crucial to tackling methane because of this dual aspect of flaring. It's a direct source of methane emissions, but it also enables the monetization and utilization of methane abated from other sources at that upstream facility. And our imported flare gas index indicates that countries like France, Norway, Spain, and Italy are exposed to high flaring by importing crude from high flaring intensity countries. To close then, we make an urgent plea for action. Flaring elimination is not a technology issue. It's due to a lack of political will and leadership to develop the appropriate markets to get that gas into effective utilisation and out of the flare. Regulation with strong monitoring enforcement are critical to both penalise gas flaring and incentivise gas utilisation. Flaring is a key component of the global drive to reduce methane, and it should be integral to oil and gas decarbonisation strategies. Thank you very much. With that, I'll hand over to Adam to talk about the Zero Routine Flaring Initiative. Over to you, Adam.
Thank you, Debbie, for those excellent insights into the state of global gas flaring in 2021. Now, I'm going to take just a few moments and a few slides to look forwards, and I'm going to introduce our Zero Routine Flaring by 2030 initiative, or the ZRF. I'm going to give an overview of its aims, its scope, and its reach. So launched back in 2015 with the support of an initial 25 endorsers and launched by the then UN Secretary General and World Bank President. The ZRF really came out of conversations here in GGFR about not just how we could go about ending routine flaring, but really given that we see this as low-hanging fruit in the climate agenda, when the world should collectively be seeking to end this wasteful and polluting practice. And these discussions led to the idea of a 2030 deadline for ending flaring and the formation of the Zero Routine Flaring Initiative. Now, the essence of the ZRF is very simple. The aim is to support and to encourage oil companies and the governments of oil-producing countries to end routine flaring at all upstream oil production sites no later than 2030. Now, as part of this initiative, we ask endorsers to make two key commitments. Firstly, that for any new oil fields, that they will be developed with zero routine flaring best practices built in and designed from the outset. But of course, for any existing or legacy assets that are being operated, that flaring will be ended at these locations as well, but no later than 2030. Now, we recognize that for our governmental endorsers, they're uniquely placed to shape the operating environment. And so that we ask that they also look at the relevant regulations and suitable policies that will enable operators in their jurisdictions to make the changes they need to end routine flaring. And lastly, we ask all of our endorsers to publicly publish their flaring data each year. And at the World Bank, we enable this through facilitating the annual publishing of this data to our website. Now, just this very final slide from me on the ZRF. So you can see that from those initial 25 endorsers back in 2015, the initiative has some really strong momentum, and we now have over 100 endorsers. So what you can see here is that the countries shaded in red are those where the governments have endorsed the ZRF. The blue dots represent the headquarters of endorsing oil companies. And together, these represent over 60% of all of the current flaring that Debbie's just presented. Now, obviously, for the initiative to achieve its aims of ending all routine flaring by 2030, we need to increase the reach of the initiative. And so what you could also see is those countries shaded in pink, those are ones that produce more than 500,000 barrels of oil a day. And really, these are the priorities for the ZRF moving forwards. So that's a very brief overview of the ZRF and what we're seeking to achieve with it. Now, if you represent an organization or oil company that would be interested in finding out more about the ZRF and potentially making an endorsement, please do reach out to us. We'd be happy to discuss the initiative in more detail. And I think with that, we now have about 20 minutes for some questions on GGFR, the data that Debbie's presented, and the ZRF.
Good. Thanks to all of you for a truly wide-ranging and thought-provoking presentation that places flaring reductions firmly in the pathways to improve operations, better access to affordable and reliable sources of energy, and also to reducing greenhouse gas emissions as a key element of the energy transition. And actually that should raise all sorts of questions for our Q&A session. Just a reminder to all of you on the audience that you can still use the Q&A box within the webinar platform to ask questions, and it's located at the bottom of your screen. And actually, it looks like we have some questions in, and a couple of them, I guess, are related to the imported flare index. And so there are two questions that you might take together. One is, what does the green color means on the slide that you were presenting on that? And the second one is, why this imported flare index should be taken into consideration by companies or countries when making decisions on where to get their oil. So maybe Zubin, would you like to take this question?
Sure.
So I don't know, if Debbie would like to take the one on the green. Oh, it's over to you, Zubin.
Thanks, Lorena. I'll be happy to start, and then Debbie and Adam can chime in if I forget anything. So the first question was, what is the green when it comes to imported flare gas index? Is that the question? Did I get that right? Yeah, so in this slide, the green is representing Libya. So in other words, Estonia, that ranks high on the imported flare gas index, is pretty much getting all of its oil from Libya. And similarly, the countries that also have green in their bar chart are getting their oil from Libya, which is a high flaring country, as Debbie showed you before. I hope that answers your question on that. There was also a question on the accuracy of the flaring data, right, Lorena? So we have a high degree of confidence in the satellite data. It has now been up for over a decade, these satellites. We've done a lot of work and back and forth with the Payne Institute at the Colorado School of Mines and the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, a U.S. government agency, to ensure the accuracy of these flaring data volumes. Now, again, we do call them estimates because nothing is ever 100% accurate, but we do have a lot of confidence in them. And should a government or an operator feel like we have not gotten it accurate, we very much welcome that dialogue to make sure that we do rectify it if there is some sort of inaccuracy or we are off the mark in any way. And we go through a data reconciliation process with a government or an operator just to make sure that we have this correct. And let me just add on that response that in my time at the World Bank and working on this program, I have not seen one instance where we have had to actually change our satellite data based upon any feedback or inputs from another government or operator. So that's a pretty good success rate so far. But again, there could be an instance where that's not the case, and we're happy to make the change if somebody can demonstrably prove to us that this is inaccurate. Debbie or Adam, would you like to come in with any additional comments on those?
Yeah, I'd actually, thank you, Zubin, that you covered the issue on data quality perfectly. I think there was a question around why countries would pay attention to the imported flare gas index in making decisions on where to get their crude from. Would you maybe like to share a little bit more from your experience on that?
Thank you for that question as well. That is a good question. When we developed the imported flare gas index, it was a question that we knew people would ask, which is, do we really think a government is all of a sudden just going to do some fuel switching or looking to other sources for their oil and gas because of the flaring or venting or methane emissions from one of their supplier countries? we recognize it's not that simple. These are very significant decisions made by a government over an extended period of time. It's not as simple as just switching your supplier, right? We fully recognize that. What we do think this helps with is for a government that is importing oil to sort of enter into a dialogue with the governments that they are importing oil from and the operators that they're importing oil from, to say, look, is there something we can do to help reduce the emissions from the production? Because this is something of importance to us as an importing country, and this is something that we as an industry have to really pay attention to now and act upon. So it's more of an influential role that these oil importing countries play, that we think that this index equips them to enter into that dialogue and also advocate and persuade governments and operators to do much better when it comes to oil production. So thanks for that question. Yeah, and in some cases, it could very well be that a country in Europe may start looking at other suppliers based upon the emissions of the product. Again, these things take a long time, but that doesn't mean that we shouldn't show governments that they have a role to play in ending emissions from the industry. It's not always just about the producer pays principle. This is a global issue, and importing countries have a role to play. And that's really the beauty of this index, we think, in terms of ending this industry practice. I will say, as we've had these discussions with some of these governments in Europe and elsewhere, the resounding response has been, wow, I didn't even know that. We've heard that from one or two governments at least. And so from that perspective, just raising awareness, this index has proved beneficial. Thanks. Adam or Debbie, please chime in if I missed any aspects of those.
Thanks a lot, Zubin.
Yeah,
and yeah, so maybe we could go on to another question about verification. So is there any authorities or third parties which can demonstrate or justify that an oil company achieved zero routine flaring?
Well, I'm sure there are some third parties that would be interested and are monitoring this. We certainly do. And I encourage everybody to go to our website and look at the flare volumes by every single oil production site that is flaring. We put that up on our website. You can visualize the flare, the volumes of the associated gas, the CO2 equivalent emissions that we estimate coming from that, and also the economic value of that associated gas that is being flared. So we certainly have a role to play in raising awareness and monitoring this globally, but I'm sure there are other organizations that could be doing the same. I hope that answers the question.
It does. So another question is, what is your view on the ETS, the emissions trading scheme, or carbon tax as a driver of reducing flaring moving forward?
So I'll maybe take this one.
Thank you.
Yeah, there's different pricing mechanisms that you can apply to incentivize emission reductions. So an emissions trading scheme or a carbon tax, we know those are incredibly effective. We just have to look to models like Norway, where there's actually both an ETS and a carbon tax, to see how well they can move the needle in terms of just decarbonisation and emission reduction generally. With flaring, there's some other mechanisms that can be leveraged, right? That can be a fee that can be applied for gas that's flared, or some sort of financial incentive for utilisation of associated gas over non-associated gas. Quite simply, how to say this, it is as simple as the gas needs to have more value in a pipeline than through the flare. So if it's incredibly expensive to flare and that gas has a value going somewhere else, that is what it's going to take. You have to have a market for the gas that makes that gas more valuable somewhere other than the flare. And that can come in part from some sort of fiscal mechanism on the flaring itself, or through some incentivizing of developing that gas market. So financial instruments are hugely important in the regulatory space, and we look at those in some detail in our global regulatory review.
Thanks a lot, Debbie. I might be jumping to a more technical question and about on how confident are you in your satellite-based estimates?
Sure, yes. So Zubin mentioned this a little bit when in his response to the first question, but these instruments on board these satellites, so we have two instruments on two NOAA, the US National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration satellites. And in partnership with the Payne Institute of Public Policy at the Colorado School of Mines, we generate estimates of flare volume from a measurement of heat. So these sensors on these satellites are detecting the heat, and at nighttime, they're very effective in delineating flares. Flares are the hottest terrestrial source, so they are even hotter than volcanoes. So these satellite instruments are very able to delineate flares. And they overfly individual flares several times a night. And then we have recorded flare volume data from a company called Sedagas that's used with this satellite measurement to do some calibration. And the heat signature of a flare is very close to proportional to the volume of that flare. So we have some comfort that we are certainly detecting flares and that we are certainly in the right ballpark of volume estimates, but there's of course uncertainty. However, in the absence of a central repository of flow meter information for every single flare globally, and recognize that at some oil and gas production facilities, there is no instrumentation measuring flare volume. And even if there was, those are notoriously problematic in terms of calibration and operation. And I'm sure many of you on the call will know that. So this is all we have in terms of a global data set, and it's certainly very informative. It's certainly detecting flares, and it helps us look at trends. So we have some comfort in using it, and as Zubin said, we've never had a situation where we've had to change our numbers because of reported numbers in any of the jurisdictions that we've worked in.
That's great. Thanks a lot, Debbie. And moving on to the next questions. So on your view, what are the main reasons for having a persisting flooding year over year?
Yeah, so sure, I'll take that one. Thank you, Lorena. So there's a number of reasons, right? But I think it's if you were to pick the top two or three, one would be just the lack of priority that operators and governments have to reduce the flaring and the venting, right? So it starts with the leadership at a political will level, and then needs to filter down to the organization that's responsible for the flare and the operator. So that's one of the main reasons. It's just a lack of priority and attention paid. The second is the economics of it, of course. And Debbie talked a little bit about this, and that's what we wanted to achieve in our financing report and also on the regulatory report. Those two reports that we've mentioned a few times today both point to how the economics are challenging, but there are cases where the economics do make sense. And there are solutions, regulatory and financial solutions that can achieve flaring reduction projects, and they can be executed that way. And as we say at the beginning of our flare tracker report, it's really not a technology issue. That is the one thing, that is the one reason why that we cannot say flaring persists because of a lack of technology. There's a variety of solutions there, whether they're modular, small scale, they are there. It's just a question, again, of the economics and the political will. I think those are primarily the two main reasons why flaring and venting persists.
That's great. Thanks a lot, Zubin. So we have another question which actually says, if facing the consequences of climate change is not enough to bring countries to invest more in utilization of natural gas, what does the World Bank considers as an efficient way to achieve this?
I'm not sure I fully understand that question. Could you?
Yeah, so basically, I mean, clearly climate change is one of the key issues and matters to take into account and start reducing and improving operations around flooding. So, but if the call for climate change is not enough, do you think there is something else, like maybe monetizing the value of natural gas or?
Yeah, okay. Yeah, I understand it. Thanks, Lorena. Yes, I think that's right. It is a question of, if you're not going to do it for the climate and environmental reasons, then certainly there's an economic reason. And if you monetize the gas and put it to effective use, then potentially that's a compelling reason for you as an operator to stop the flaring and venting, right? And that is the economic case that's being made. So I
think there's also, I mean, we're really seeing an interesting dialogue happening at the moment around energy security. So the opportunity that recovering these wasted gas volumes presents, either for the energy security of the oil producing country itself, or to be exported to provide energy security to importing countries. So energy security is an important discussion topic at the moment, and one that we feel is important in the flare reduction journey.
Yeah, thanks, Debbie, for reminding me about that. A really good point, because as you will recall, at the beginning of our presentation, I mentioned that the United States government and Germany were joining our partnership at the World Bank. And one of the comments that the US President Joe Biden made at this forum last Friday was exactly this point, which is the amount that is flared around the world, the 144 billion cubic meters annually, is more than the amount of gas that is imported from Russia into the European Union. So that gives you a good idea of the dimension and the energy security aspects of flaring and venting as well, as we put in our report, as Debbie added just a moment ago.
Good. Thanks, both of you, for a very good answers. And I see that we have only 2 minutes left. So probably I will be wrapping up here. But before, I would like to say a huge thanks to Zubin and Debbie and Adam, our presenters today, for the excellent presentations and for being put on the spot and answering such a wide range of questions. And also to all of you on the line for taking the time out and listening and asking questions. And as mentioned earlier, a recording of this webinar will be available in the next couple of days with a link to the slides, and can be accessed on the same link as the live webinar. And don't forget that you can download the World Bank Global Gas Flaring Tracker Report for 2022 and the IPCA, IOGP, and GTFR new guidance document on flaring management for the oil and gas industry from the Results Future. So thanks again. Have a great rest of the week and stay safe. And goodbye.